Hello and welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neal Howard. Thank you for joining us on the program today. In studio with us today is Brendan Gaughran, returning to talk with us about how toxins get into our bodies unwittingly. We don't know that these toxins are getting into our bodies. We're just eating a sandwich or drinking a glass of water or buying our favorite juice. But our guest is here today to talk about some of the pitfalls out there as we strive to find that best healthy diet. Welcome to Health Professional Radio, Brendan.
Hey, thank you very much, Neal. I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming back. You're the liver medic. How did you get into holistic health or gut health?
Oh, sure. So I graduated with a degree in molecular biology, transitioned to the pharmaceutical industry, and noticed very quickly that they were essentially synthesizing what was taking place in nature. So I just decided more or less to go right to the source, got into nutraceuticals, which is essentially vitamin supplements, and noticed that there were quite a few problems just in my family members and friends with type 2 diabetes and obesity and fatty liver and adrenal fatigue. And, that typical, that list comes under the heading of metabolic syndrome. Really isn't a whole lot out there to help these individuals. So that's where we focused a lot of our health and alternative medicines.
You mentioned that you realized that these companies were basically synthesizing what was going on in nature. Once you decided to go straight to the source and become an expert in supplements as well as in liver and gut health, in your opinion, when do you think it was that we realized that supplements should be implemented because of what we're doing, trying to copy nature? Is that what happened? Or did someone just say, hey, you know what? Supplements seem like a good idea to enhance the food that's already wonderful anyway?
Well, this is a very complex. Let me see if I can unpack this question because it's a really good question. I think that, decades ago when we had problems with severe disease and the pharmaceutical industry was basically called upon to come up with solutions, antibiotics, things for polio, I think we quickly jumped on a bandwagon and said, this is sort of the panacea for everything. So every time we have an issue, we're going to go to the pharmaceutical industry. And we sort of forgotten our sort of natural roots, which are ancient cultures, which understood how to get rid of bacterial infections and viral infections and other diseases in a more holistic way. And we don't have a lot of shaman around anymore. So I think the West sort of naturally gravitated to the science piece. And I think now we're just starting to understand that that's not exactly the panacea. And a lot of these things are found in nature and the pharmaceutical industry is not interested in those solutions because they can't patent it. Therefore, they can't make money off of them. So that's why we talk about the information we try to get out there is education, trying to combat a lot of misinformation from other areas.
You talked about these ancient cultures and shaman removing things from the body, these diseases, these toxins. But don't you think that removing them was much simpler or much more basic based on how they got into the body in the first place? Now that we're synthesizing, as you said, nature, aren't these toxins getting into our bodies in much more, for lack of a better term, sophisticated ways, requiring more sophisticated methods of removal?
Yes. That's the short answer to that. So, if we look at the chemical industry, for example, in the U.S., the tanker trucks that roll down the street, the 18-wheelers that usually carrying chemicals, 625,000 of those tanker trucks are synthesized every day, full of chemicals, just for Americans. Okay. So when we take a look at that, and then we take a look at all the endocrine disrupting chemicals that we find in personal healthcare products, things like plastic bottles, deodorants, toothpaste, shampoo, these are things that are coming in contact with our body directly. They're transdermal. And then on top of that, you start having the discussion about, GMO foods, the conversation that Monsanto and alike do not want to have is exactly how much herbicides and pesticides are now being thrown on the topsoil in our plants before we get it. They'd rather have a conversation about how we are advancing the seed by, taking a genetic string of X, Y, and Z and inseminating it into another DNA strain. They do not want to have a conversation about these really dangerous herbicides and pesticides, some of which are based upon Agent Orange. So this is not, a kid-friendly type of conversation to have, and not something that we ought to be consuming. It's destroying the topsoil. It's also having a negative impact on pollinating insects, and it is certainly a driving force behind the destruction of our GI tract. Leaky gut ends up ensuing. More toxins are able to get into the body, and as you said, it becomes a much more difficult job metabolically to remove these things as a result.
So if I'm understanding correctly, in your opinion, the GMO technology that exists and is being extensively utilized in every area of our food production and intake is the greatest source of these toxins that seem to be causing so many problems?
Yeah, again, that's in my opinion. However, when I go out and I speak to functional doctors, naturopaths, and alike, that's what they're telling me. They say when they have somebody who comes in with leaky gut and liver problems and endocrine problems, the first thing that they do is they put them on an organic diet, and they immediately see results. We end up getting phone calls from the Midwest from farmers who eat organic food but are farming GMO seed, and that's an economics decision. Okay, but when they call me and they tell me that they have what is commonly referred to as farmer's lung. And if your listeners don't know what that is a farmer who has a GMO crop and the pesticides and herbicides, this GMO Roundup specifically and the glyphosate in there, are so dangerous that even putting it down on the soil in hazmat suit is creating a problem where they're taking in too much toxins into their lungs, and they have to call people like myself to try and get those things out.
Are these companies funded or in bed with, for lack of a better term, pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah, it's a very incestual relationship. You'll find that companies like Dow Chemical are on the boards of companies like Merck, and they're invested in companies like ADM and Monsanto, and they all have the same vested interest. And the vested interest is to create a product that the farmer has to go buy every year. They control the market. You can't get seeds from previous generations. So the farmer ends up essentially being a production line worker for Monsanto and alike. Yes. And of course, they need a ton of chemicals. So Dow Chemical is obviously involved, and it's creating disease. And that's when the pharmaceutical company ends up getting a piece of this. Now, I'm not saying they sit around the table and discuss this thing, like villains in a. However, this is it's a business model, and it's profitable, and there's no incentive for them to stop it.
Now, you're the liver medic, and the liver is, it filters everything that goes into our body, if I understand it correctly. Talk about your web presence as the liver medic. Talk about the website. What would we, as consumers or just folks interested, find once we navigate to that website?
Sure. Yeah. I think one of the things that's sort of commonly unknown is the liver is responsible for over 500 different chemical reactions. Many of them have to do with detoxifying the body, breaking down hormones, regulating your endocrine system, regulating blood glucose. That's one of the reasons why type 2 diabetes is so tightly associated with fatty liver disease. And when they end up coming to livermedic.com, they will end up taking a look at articles that explain metabolism in a sort of an easy, understandable format. They'll take a look and see diets that are easy to follow and other descriptions of associated problems. A lot of people end up calling up and saying, look, I didn't understand the connection between leaky gut, chronic inflammation, and one of the reasons why I'm so depleted of energy. And my physician ended up telling me that I had adrenal fatigue. So all of those things are related, and at least there is a place. This was the impetus for this, a place where people can go and sort of connect the dots.
Now, when you're traveling around and giving lectures and talks and whatnot, what type of response do you get from people that are practitioners in traditional Western medicine?
Well, I don't get a whole lot of conventional docs. So I get the more progressive functional physicians who are pretty much on board with what I'm talking about already. But there are a couple of things that they pull out of the conversation that they didn't know before. For instance, I would say only 30% of the physicians that I talk to are aware of what they refer to as the MTHFR gene mutation, which affects up to 30% of the population and negatively impacts the body's ability to, again, break down toxins and remove them and break down hormones, which can throw off your whole endocrine system. So properly testing patients for that is critical. That's one of the things that they pull away right away. The other thing is when I talk about antibiotics, the amount of antibiotics that people are consuming nowadays is twice as much as we used to consume 20 years ago. And immediately the physicians end up putting their hands up and hollering and saying, look, scripts are way down. It's not coming from us. And they're absolutely right. It's coming from the cattle and pork and chicken industry, which is consolidating. Wow. And therefore they are using a lot more antibiotics to make sure that they don't end up with diseased animals that they can't put into the food chain. So the physicians are right. I am right. And the consumer is paying the price.
And who thinks about it that way ever? Nobody.
Right. Right. And this is one of the reasons why 1 in 3 people have liver problems or liver disease. And I don't know if I can say a majority of people have leaky gut, but I can say a majority of people have candida overgrowth. And that is typically this superstorm of GMO foods and sugar and carb overindulgence and antibiotics. And, the intestinal tract is there to make sure that they block toxins from coming in the body while also trying to absorb nutrients. That's a very complex sort of transaction that takes place. And as soon as we start screwing around with the microbiome, you will get a combination of malnourishment and toxin overload. And that's, I think, what's taking place. That's the trend in this country and what we have to reverse.
Wow. Once again, tell our listeners where they can go online and get more information about you and liver supplements.
Yes, so that's livermedic.com. And yes, of course, we have the supplements listed there. One of the main ones is apatibin. Half of the ingredients are dedicated to detoxifying the liver, and the other half are dedicated to repairing the GI tract. And just a boatload of interesting articles that people can go ahead and take a look at.
Great. Well, I thank you for talking with us today, Brendan.
Oh, thank you very much, Neal. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neal Howard, talking with Brendan Gaughran, the liver medic. He's been in studio talking about some of the ways that toxins are now getting into our system as opposed to in the past, and some of the more invasive ways that are needed to get these toxins out. Also, some of the dangers about the GMO technology that exists as a whole. Transcripts and audio of this program are available at healthprofessionalradio.com.au and also at hpr.fm, and you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes.